Hey everyone, Richard here with this week's reading of Shard of the Sun. If you missed my last video, I'm doing the weekly readings from my book Shard of the Sun, and chapter 1 and the intro were posted last week, one video, and this is chapter 2, so we're picking up where I left off, and we'll just jump into it. So, here we go, chapter 2. Muirwood was a sprawling metropolitan. It bustled with commerce from sunrise to sunset, with vendors and artists coming from all over Runde to sell their wares. The city was old, built long before the invasion of demonic hordes that had nearly destroyed the human population. After the war, it was one of the first cities to be re-inhabited. Broderick could see the various dwellings, built of stone and wood, jutting up from the landscape. The city had been built in a deep valley surrounded by rolling green hills. From his vantage point, he could see the twisting streets crowded with people. Several large warehouses were located outside of the city to hold inbound wagons until nightfall. The streets were normally so crowded that wagons were not able to enter the city until they cleared. Broderick knew this, of course, and so planned to visit one of the taverns after trying to sell his meteorite. Farmland covered a lot of the hillsides. His cousin's lands were the most noticeable. Acres upon acres were covered with honeysuckle. Rows of trellis, so long that he could not see the end of them, were used to grow the bright yellow-flowered vines. The nectar of the honeysuckle was highly valued. Each flower could only produce a few drops, and to produce enough for the kind of production his cousin was responsible for required a lot of land. Aside from the nectar, which was the major source of income, the vines had strongly fibrous stems and were used for binding and textiles. The flowers also produced an intense fragrance, favored among the nobles. As Broderick neared the city, he steered his wagon to one of the warehouses. A man in uniform approached, followed by a scribe. "Good afternoon, sir," the scribe greeted. "What goods will you be checking into the city?" Broderick returned the greeting with a smile. "I bring lumber." The scribe carried sheaves of paper and a piece of charcoal. He scribbled something down, muttering under various numbers and names to himself. He looked up at Broderick, his face scrunching in thought. "Remind me of your name again." "Broderick," he told the scribe. The man's face lit up with recognition. "Ah, I knew it started with a B. You know the protocol for wagon deliveries is to wait until nightfall, but fortunately for you, we are short on lumber and need the delivery immediately." The scribe turned to the man in the uniform. "Pay the man, please, and then have them bring the wagon in through the eastern gate." The man nodded and tossed a small purse of gold coins to Broderick. The scribe looked back at him. We will have one of our men bring the wagon in. Don't worry about your horses or wagon. Once the lumber is unloaded, they will bring the wagon back to this warehouse for your retrieval whenever you are ready to leave." "Very well," Broderick replied. He rolled up the clean clothes he brought with him and made sure none of the leather pouches had come loose from his belt. Nodding to the scribe, he climbed down from the wagon and made his way to one of the many points of entry. Guards checked everyone coming in to ensure the safety of the city. Weapons were not allowed inside, and neither were any goods. Everything had to be checked into the warehouses and brought in by the workers of Muirwood. Broderick entered the city quicker than most seeking entrance, as he was not carrying anything in with him except clothing. The bustle of the city was overwhelming to most people. The amount of foot traffic that traveled through the streets day to day was considerable. Hundreds of people crammed the streets, each trying to move through the crowd with an air of self-importance. Broderick laughed at them. The majority of them were barely above poverty. He muscled his way through the crowds as well, navigating his way towards a shop known as the Mercantile. A middle-aged man known as Torg owned it. His shop was a place where, if one had enough money, anything could be found. Broderick pushed his way through the current of people and onto the street that housed the shop. It was less crowded than the main road, but still congested. A bell jingled as he entered the shop, and Torg greeted him. Torg had once been a soldier, with muscles large and a resume of deeds to be envied. The man Broderick looked at was a shell of that former glory. Torg had a huge belly and stooped forward. The center of his head was bald, while the rest of his hair had turned to a grayish white. His beard was the same color as the hair on his head, but much thicker. A long wooden counter separated Torg's goods and the customers who entered. "Good to see you again, Torg," Broderick said. Torg smiled and extended his hands. "If it isn't my favorite customer," the shop owner replied. Broderick very much doubted that. He had only visited the Mercantile a handful of times. And the truth was, Torg said that to every customer. "What brings you into my world today?" Broderick withdrew the rock from his pouch and laid it on the countertop. Torg picked it up and eyed it. "It's a meteorite," Broderick said. "It fell from the sky last night near my house. How much for it?" Broderick was expecting a huge payday. Torg turned it over in his hands, eyeing every detail. "Nothing," he answered. Broderick's mouth dropped. "What do you mean, nothing?" Torg laid it back on the counter. "It's an interesting piece, I'll give you that, but it is not a meteorite." Broderick raised an eyebrow. "It fell from the sky." Torg smiled disarmingly. "I'm not saying it didn't. I'm saying it's not a meteorite." Broderick scratched his chin. "Then what is it?" Torg shrugged. "I haven't the slightest idea, to be honest, but it is pretty. Let me see, I'll give you—" He paused, looking at the smooth rock again. 20 gold. Broderick snorted derisively. "No thanks." He grabbed the rock and started to leave. "Wait," he heard Torg say. Broderick stopped but didn't turn around. 25 gold, and your choice of anything in the shop." Broderick shook his head. "I'd rather—" His words were drowned out by a scream from outside. Broderick stepped out to see what was going on. A crowd had quickly formed around something. Broderick noticed his wagon and horses nearby. "What happened?" he asked someone walking away from the crowd. The man shook his head sadly. "Poor girl was run over by the horses," he answered. Broderick was crushed. A child run over by his horses. What else could go wrong? He pushed through the crowd to find a girl, no more than 10, lying on the ground in a pool of blood. "Oh no," he whispered voicelessly. It was Claire, his cousin's daughter. Tears flooded his eyes as he bent down beside her. "What happened?" he cried out. Nobody answered. Her dream of becoming rich was the last thing on his mind now. He gingerly pulled her into his arms and stroked her hair. He shook his head over and over. This can't be happening. He stared into her face and remembered when his cousin had given him the news that his wife was having a baby. It was believed his cousin's wife was barren for years, and then she got pregnant. Claire was a miracle child. Broderick could faintly hear the sound of the city guard coming. Through watery eyes, he thought he saw Claire's eyes flutter. He wiped the tears away so he could see clearly. Nothing. It was a trick of his mind, seeing what he wanted to see. And then he heard someone in the crowd gasp. He looked up to see several people wide-eyed and pointing. "She moved!" someone yelled. Broderick looked down to see Claire staring at him. "Claire, are you all right? Where does it hurt?" The little girl didn't answer at first, but just stared at him. Her eyes. There was something in her eyes that seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. He hugged her tightly. "I'm not in pain," she finally answered. Broderick searched her for any wounds, but found none. "Are you sure?" he asked. "You're covered in blood." Claire nodded her head. "I'm fine. I remember the horses didn't stop. They hurt me, and everything went dark. I couldn't see anything, and then I opened my eyes, and you were here." She smiled. "I've missed you, Uncle Broderick." She returned his hug. Broderick could hear the familiar voice of his cousin shouting, "Claire! Claire, where are you?" The crowd parted to let the man through. Broderick looked up to see his cousin, Derek. Derek saw the blood on his daughter and went into a panic. "What happened? Is she injured? Call for my physicians." Broderick shook his head. "She seems fine, cousin." As if to prove his words, Claire got up and ran to her father. "Really, Daddy, I am fine." Derek hugged his daughter close. "I do not want you. I told you not to walk into the road," he scolded lovingly. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I won't do it again." Derek nodded his head and looked at the man who had been driving the wagon. "You," he said menacingly, pointing, "consider yourself a dead man." The city guards arrived. "What happened here?" the captain demanded. Several people started talking at once. The captain held his hand up for silence. "One at a time," he instructed. "That man driving the wagon ran over this little girl," someone said. "And then that man healed her," another chimed in. Numerous people agreed. Broderick looked around, incredulous. "I didn't heal anyone," he said. "I heard the cracking of bone," said the first person. "And she was dead. She wasn't breathing," said another. The captain didn't know what to make of the situation. "Take the driver into custody," he ordered one of his men. "Does the girl need medical attention?" he asked. Derek shook his head. "I will have my physicians look her over," he replied. The captain nodded. "Very good. Everyone else, go about your business. You're blocking traffic." The crowd seemed hesitant to disperse, but finally they went on their way. Derek held his daughter's hand. "Broderick, my cousin, you'll be staying with me at my estate," he announced. Broderick smiled. "You are too kind, but I will not be a burden on you." "Nonsense." Derek waved his hand. "Come now, you look like you could use a bath. And besides, I have some news for you." He smiled. Broderick always found it hard to tell his cousin no. Derek's home was more like a palace. When one had the money he did, anything one wanted could be had. Broderick had been there several times before and always found it to be a bit too much. What use did someone have for that many servants anyway? His cousin's estate was located away from the hectic pace of the market area. It was situated on the top of a hill. Several roads led out from the house, some leading to the city and some to his honeysuckle farms. Derek's villa was a sprawling complex that consisted of 4 buildings. A smooth cobblestone path led to the large courtyard that sat in the middle of the multiplex. A single building sat on the north, east, and west sides of the courtyard, with the 4th building also on the west side, though not as close to the main dwellings. The courtyard was decorated with statues of various mythical creatures, benches, and a fountain in the center. The 3 buildings were connected to each other by beautiful gardens with sweet-smelling flowers of all kinds. Each building looked exactly alike on the outside, though they all served a completely different purpose. The building to the north was the family dwelling, where Derek and his wife and child lived. The building to the east was an oversized kitchen where one could find any variety of food any time of the day. After sunset, the kitchen was free of servants, making it a self-serve kitchen. The buildings to the west was the servant quarters. Typically, servants lived further from the main dwellings, but Derek found the closer they were, the quicker it was to have their services. The 4th building, which was a couple of 100 feet from the servant quarters, was where the harvested honeysuckle was brought and bottled. Derek led Broderick along the stone path and through the courtyard into the main building. Broderick shook his head, as he did every time when they stepped inside. They walked into a massive atrium. "You have too much money," Broderick said. Derek looked quizzically at his cousin and then smiled in understanding. "It is a popular design," he answered. "The space allows the house to be well lit and ventilated. I find the room to be quite useless, but my wife loves it. Ah, here she is." Claire ran over and sat with Octavia, who was sitting on a bench looking at a myriad of colored flowers that rose out from the porcelain vase next to the bench. "Octavia, dear, you remember Broderick?" Octavia turned and smiled. "I remember. We are indebted to you for saving our daughter," she said. "Thank you." The last was spoken solemnly. "I can't imagine my life without my dear Claire." Broderick shrugged. "I didn't do anything, really. I just happened to be in the same part of town when I heard a scream. I had no idea what happened. All I did was hold her in my arms. I thought she was—" His words broke, and he had to pause to calm his quavering voice. "She was unharmed, and for that I am thankful." Claire turned her attention to Broderick. That same look he saw in the market shone in her eyes. It made him uncomfortable. Broderick turned his gaze to Octavia. "I hope I'm not being a burden," he said, changing the subject. Octavia laughed. "Oh, please. Your family, Broderick. You are welcome here any time." Derek nodded his agreement. "Indeed, cousin. Please make yourself comfortable. The servants are preparing dinner as we speak." Broderick felt the term dinner was an understatement. Feast would have been more appropriate. The servants brought in freshly baked loaves of bread, soups of all kinds, a plate full of various cheeses, and bottles of the expensive honeysuckle. He ate and drank his fill, and noticed the sun was beginning to set. The servants came through and lit candles, placing them around the atrium. Broderick yawned and stretched. He was much more tired than he thought. Derek noticed and knew his cousin was probably ready to rest. "Come outside with me," he said, motioning Broderick to follow him. They stepped out into the courtyard. The statues had an eerie appearance in the fading light. A gentle breeze stirred, reminding them that summer had yet to burn fiercely. "I have a question, cousin." Broderick nodded and told him to speak it. "In the market today, what the people said, is it true?" Broderick seemed confused. "Is what true?" "After the accident, when the guards came, some of the people said you healed my daughter. Is it true?" Broderick chuckled. "No, I'm no healer. You should know that. People see what they want to see. Perhaps they wanted to see a miracle because Claire appeared to be hurt, but really wasn't. I honestly don't know why anyone would think that." Derek nodded, but wasn't confused. What about all the blood? Broderick had thought of that, but he didn't know how there could be blood when there were no wounds on the child. Maybe it wasn't hers. I don't know that either. Both men remained silent for a long moment. "Well, I suppose it doesn't matter. Claire is fine and is as joyful as ever. I'm sure you would like to get some sleep." Derek escorted Broderick back into the house and to a room located off the atrium. "You can use this room while you're here, and stay as long as you like. I don't know how you keep your sanity living in the woods alone. It's not normal, cousin. Derek grinned. Broderick playfully pushed his cousin out of the way and shut the door behind the man. He pulled his shirt off and fell into the bed. It was softer and more comfortable than anything he had ever laid on. He rolled onto his back and stared up at the ceiling, going over their conversation. Where had all that blood come from, if not from Claire? And the look in her eyes. Broderick shivered. As he was slowly drifting asleep, the sudden realization struck him. The bird. All right, that's it for Chapter 2, so make sure you check back Friday for Chapter 3. I'll be uploading new chapters every Friday. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you're enjoying the story so far. See you guys.